Did a great job with that. It was very, very good. Concerning God's sovereign will and our will to do God's will, really, is what I'm talking about here. In 2 Timothy, the second chapter, you were reading from that chapter just a moment ago, but Paul had warned them against the people who were teaching false doctrine, those who were false teachers. And he said, beginning in verse 21, if a man therefore purge himself from these, that means there's something for us to do, it's conditional. If a man purge himself from these, he shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, prepared unto every good work. So there's something for us to do to be of God's service, to do His will. We have to purge ourselves from things and make ourselves a vessel of honor in His service, and He'll use us. But I believe that's the way His will is done in us. It's not just overriding our will, but we have to cooperate with Him, and we should pray that we'll be a vessel of honor in His service. In fact, I do that. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
You did great, Ben. And I feel bad because I have a question that's puzzling me, and it's kind of sticky, and I don't know if there's a good answer. But over in Judges chapter 14, there's a passage there about Samson, which I'm having trouble making sense of. I just want to know if you have any insight. It's in Judges 14, verses 1 through... I lost it. Judges 14, verse 4 is what caught my eye. But this is when Samson is first going, and he's seeking a wife of the Philistines. And he sort of has an argument with his parents, saying, I saw this woman who's a daughter of the Philistines, and go get her as a wife for me. And his father and mother say, aren't there any women among your own relatives that would be suitable? Why do you seek a wife of the Philistines? But Samson said to his father, verse 3, take her for me, for she is right in my eyes. But verse 4 says, however, his father and mother did not know that it was of Yahweh, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. It's really strange. It sounds like what it's saying is Samson had this desire for this woman, but it was God's moving in order to cause him to come into conflict with the Philistines. Is this just something that's particular to the time of the judges? I realize it says the Spirit of God was working in various ways among the judges to bring them into conflict with the enemies of God's people, but I don't know. It's just odd to me. What do you think about it?
So, no, I don't think that's particular to the time of the judges. Typically, I think that's how God works providentially, specifically through or for the sovereign or the decretive will. I think it would be similar to how God hardened the heart of Pharaoh in Exodus, not necessarily by supernaturally forcing his will to do something that he would not have done before, but by calling forth this shepherd ex-convict to walk up to him and to tell him, hey, you're going to let your slave force go. You got to let them go. And in those ways, through the situations in which God used, he basically moved Pharaoh to do something that he would do. This is the same concept that Habakkuk asks God why he's using the Chaldeans. How can he be justified in using the Chaldeans? And God says that after I use the Chaldeans, I'm going to punish them for doing this because it was not for my glory. But it's a good example, similar of Nebuchadnezzar, of how God can use even wicked people to accomplish His sovereign will.
Yeah, Ben, that was great. Really enjoyed that. I don't know. Maybe this. I think this thing is a bigger deal than it might seem like it is. We all listen to what they call Christian radio, or I guess maybe on the internet now more these days. But for years, I listened to Charles Stanley, and that was the bulk of his preaching. I think he's either retired or dead or both now. I don't remember. Seems like he did pass away this year maybe, but that was everything he said seemed in some way or another to be directed toward helping people figure out how to read the will of God. And I just think I think it's unfortunate that a man preaches that way, and that's the bulk of his preaching. And I'm wandering here. A few years ago, a member of the church, I was criticizing something, I don't know, about in this category, and the brother said, well, why don't we just let them have that, you know? And I guess I'm asking you to maybe comment and explicitly comment about, you know, a lot of the folks out there that hold this view are people that have never obeyed the gospel of Christ. They believe they have. They make a claim to Jesus, but they've never obeyed the gospel. They're not technically in the kingdom of Christ. And yet, they are basing their life decisions on this assumption that the Lord is leading them, and they aren't even members of the body of Christ. So, I don't know, could you say about that or talk about that a little bit? I know you have, kind of, but speak to that a little bit, please.
Yeah, so one of the questions that I received at home after presenting this was, if you had an elevator pitch, how would you explain this to somebody? And I wouldn't, honestly. I think I can use a lot of those phrases that they use honestly. I think if somebody tells me that they believe that God is leading them to do this, I can say, well, I think God's leading me to do this, and this is where it says it. This is how I know it. And I think this is more of a later thing, and that's a concept that can be thrown out for more questioning, but that's kind of how I feel about it. I don't think I would be very confrontational about the topic to somebody who wasn't a Christian.
Yeah. It's just that I observed that much of the time when you hear people on YouTube or wherever talking about how they're trying to discern the will of the Lord, or they've got something they think the Lord is leading them to do, and a lot of the time I can look at it and listen to it and think, well, really all that is their conscience.
Yeah.
It's not the Lord speaking to them directly, it's just their conscience which has been educated correctly or incorrectly on some issue, and that's what's leading them, I think. But anyway, a great job. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben. Kind of in reference to what Noel was saying, I thought you gave a good explanation that I don't know where I heard these terms. They've been helpful for me, kind of stuck with me. I think it's helpful to distinguish between primary and secondary causality with God. So there are some things that seem evil that are attributed to God, and people have this idea of how could God do such an evil thing? Well, it's not that he directly did it, but he allowed it to happen. And since everything is under his permissive will, he allowed it to happen, it can be attributed to him, though he is not the one who directly operated it. I think this explains like the situation with the Chaldeans. He can use them, he allows them to do this thing that they're wanting to do on their own, and yet he's going to punish them after they've done it and use their evil to accomplish something that he wanted to have done. But they still retain free will and culpability for some of what has occurred.
Right.
Primary and secondary causality.
Very helpful.
All right, great, Kate.
Very interesting. A lot to the topic, and it is something that's all around us with our friends who are very sincere, and they would describe themselves as very spiritual. And it also is a big help to them many times. When some tragedy happens in their life, they say, well, that's part of God's plan for me. And they take great comfort in that. Well, my elevator speech on this is Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11. And the ESV says, again, I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. So the fastest runner does not always win the race. And the strongest army doesn't always win the battle. And why is that? Time and chance happens. So there is such a thing as being in the right place at the right time, wrong place at the right time. So I was at a track meet for one of my granddaughters. My son-in-law comes up to sit beside us, and he says, "Oh, did you lose a $5 bill?" I didn't lie. I said, "No." So he picked it up. He was in the right place. Somebody lost that $5 bill. You might say wrong place for them. Time and chance happens to everyone. I don't think it's wise to say every $5 bill we find is a message from God. So God does have messages for all of us, but we can clutter our lives with things that aren't God's messages while ignoring those things that are. So whenever someone does this, I think whenever someone says this is just God's plan for me, I try to always be very, very respectful to them, and yet try to ask them a question that might help them understand, don't we have something to do with our relationship with God? And that verse has been very helpful to me.
Thank you.
The most interesting thing about that is that you were in the track. Alex Wilson.
I don't so much as have a question as much as just seeking clarification and almost just boiling it down. I would like to say, you said a lot of stuff, and I don't think I can disagree with any of it. I think I agree with all of it. What I want to just run by you is the boiled down and simple truth of what you're saying is, yes, there is an individual will for us. However, that is expressed within the bounds of our moral obligation to the Bible, and we can find the expectations of God for us within that. However, understanding his omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, all of our walks are different. All of the things we experience are different. And yet his individual will for me would be to uphold the universal standard within the trials that I face. Correct?
Yeah, that last phrase, that was a good way to put it.
Okay.
One of the conversations we had when I first started talking to people about this concept is it's important to remember that God generally deals with people corporately rather than necessarily individually. And so specifically in the New Testament, there's a body of law, and that is considered the moral will. And it's the will of every individual inside that corporation to uphold the will of God. And so individually, yes, the will is for you to get in there, but it's not really the way that Gary Friesen describes, the idealized life plan.
Well, if I could make a comment, Alex, I think we need to be careful about the language we use. The people who believe in this idea of a special individual will for me, when they say that, they mean, for example, that of all the women in the world, there is one woman that you need to find who is intended for you, and vice versa. One of the examples Gary Friesen gives is a young couple come to him and they say, I was called to marry her, she was called to marry me. The problem is she's called to be a missionary in South America, I'm called to be a missionary in Africa. How are we going to work this out? That's the sort of thing they're talking about when they're talking about a special individual will. You're talking about fitting your life to whatever the Word of God says. So be careful about using the same language they use, because you're going to be misunderstood, probably. Is that fair comment?
Oh, yes.
Roger Boone.
Thank you. When you first started off, I have a question. I actually have a question. And I don't know the answer, and I'm just going to stand up here and put it out there, and you'll answer me, or someone else will say something to me. But when you started off, you mentioned these three wills: sovereign, moral, and individual. And you had a word put in there, and I'm going to start at the bottom. Individual will looks to me like it's a missable will. You had that word in there at the beginning.
Right.
Because you had the target and the dot in the middle. It's possible to miss the dot and either be somewhere else on the target, secondary, or even miss the target, I guess. It's a missable will. And God's moral will, that said missable also. We could miss that. We have something to do with that, and we could miss that. Sovereign will looks to me like that, you said. It's non-missable.
Correct.
It's going to happen no matter what. And I think that might be part of predetermination too, predestining. God has predestined certain things. So sovereign will, non-missable. The question I really had, though, is can God's, obviously, in individual will, man's free will overrides God's individual will sometimes. It's missable. And God, moral will, man's free will overrides God's moral will sometimes. Then you come to sovereign will. I want to reverse it now. Does God's sovereign will ever override man's free will? That's really my question. What do you think about that?
That's a really big question.
Yeah.
And as far as this study, I'm comfortable with two propositions. That God is sovereign and that man has free will. And they're not contradictory. There's a lot of theory that goes into the nature of how those two play together. But no, I don't believe that God ever impedes anybody's free will. I think what the decisions that they make are, they're going to be held accountable for them because they are freely made.
I believe that God does override man's free will when his sovereign will is in jeopardy. Balaam is an example. Balaam wanted to curse Israel, and it was not God's will that Israel be cursed, and his free will was overridden, and every time he opened his mouth, he blessed Israel. And so when it's a choice between God's sovereign will and man's free will, God's sovereign will is the trump card on that one.
That's a good example.
Nebuchadnezzar ate grass. Nathan said. What that has to do with this, I don't know, but
It wasn't his will.
I don't think he was planning on
Well, now that I think about it, Samson's kind of an interesting example of what Roger was talking about there, because God's intention for Samson was him to be a Nazirite, and of course he didn't cut his hair, but he didn't live like one of God's people in a lot of ways. And I think the story of Samson shows us not behaving in ways that align with God's moral will. And yet, God still used him to bring judgment on the Philistines. God intended to do that all along. I don't think he intended to bring judgment on them with Samson with his eyes gouged out, chained up in the middle of the pagan temple, and to collapse the roof and to bring judgment on them that way. But that's the way that Samson ended up going, and God was able to accomplish what he set out to do with Samson either way. Now, Samson could have saved himself a lot of pain, I think, in that process if he had lived in a way that accorded with God's moral will. But that's the thought I had.
I don't know exactly how to address this, but when we're talking about God's sovereign will, Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to God. God's sovereign will covers everything that happens. And I think what you meant or I interpreted what was up here about God's sovereign will not being missable is whatever happened or whatever is happening is God's will, or it wouldn't be happening, or it wouldn't have happened. But you can't know God's will in the future because it's not, unless it's revealed, and it's not revealed. I mean, if it's his sovereign will apart from his what, moral will? Is that
Right.
what you said? There's different terms for these. And I don't think God's sovereign will ever impedes or cancels free choice permanently. Even in the case of Balaam, after Balaam made his 4 oracles, when he left, he told Balak, if you want to get these people compromised and defeated, you need to tell them to commit adultery with these women right here, which they did, and then they suffered loss. It says that several chapters later that Balaam did that. And so man has free will. But when you're talking about God's sovereign will, you have to deal with God's foreknowledge. And of course, I know you and I differ on that, Roger. But I believe God's foreknowledge covers everything. And I don't think that's a problem because I don't know what God's will is unless it's revealed in the Word. No one does. The fact that he knows something about people's lives down the road does not impede free will because we don't know what he knows. All we know is what's written in the book, and that's what we have to do. Anyway, do you have a last comment?
Nope, just appreciate everyone for letting me speak. Thankful for the elders of the congregation for instilling the confidence in me.